6 o'clock. You like to stay on time?
No, it was like, I did. I mean, I feel good inside. I mean,
It's 6 o'clock. We like to stay on time with our program, so we're welcoming Bill Jamerson from Perfect. Okay. We're here to welcome Bill Jamerson from the UP of Michigan, filmmaker, storyteller, and he's coming to tell us about the logging history. And the best part is tomorrow he's going to our St. Croix Falls Elementary School and putting on a special program just for the 4th graders. Yes, we are so excited about this. We're trying to be creative and think outside the box and how to get history into the local history into the kids. And Rita Platt was like, free speaker, we'll take him. So and then we said, well, would you do one for the public? So he's seeing us tonight, and tomorrow we'll go to the elementary school. So yeah. Also, I'm going to say afterwards we have coffee and treats for you to enjoy, and we'll have our membership forms up there for anybody who would be interested in supporting our local historical society. And the future looks bright. We have a lot of young, ambitious people on the board. We have, oh, turn it up. Awesome. Okay, sounds good. So yeah, let's welcome Bill Jamerson.
Well, thank you, Shayla. And the reason I'm here and the school is because she took the effort to write the grant. And the money is out there, but it takes these workers like her and others to make it happen. If you're not a member of your historical society, join it. The dues are probably, I'm guessing, $10 a year, something ridiculous. And it's important because it's the connection to future generations. They need to hear these stories that life is hard. Life is hard now, okay? But our great-great-grandfathers and ancestors had it much, much harder. And when I go into schools, that's one of the main themes. After I tell the stories, I always remind them, you're made of the same stuff as your great-granddad. You could work in the woods all day for 10 hours if you had to. You don't believe you could, but you can. You're made of the same stuff. You don't give up. They need to hear this because they're not getting it from their parents, and they're certainly not getting it in the schools. So that's one of the main reasons history is so important. It's not stories about the past. It's who we are today. Our independence, our self-reliance, our sacrifice, all these qualities that made our ancestors great. That's why we learn about it. Okay, you can start the video now. And by the way, where would this video be available? Which historical?
Through the St. Croix Falls Historical Society someplace, right?
It'll be available. And so what you do is, if you know
Online.
Online.
Yeah.
It'll be on YouTube, basically.
Put it on YouTube.
So if you know someone who should have been here tonight, send them a link to it. And say, hey, join our historical society. We're doing good things. We need to get that going. Because I travel all over the country, and these historical societies need, new blood. They need new volunteers. It's not easy. And if you've got just a couple hours a month to do something. And I might also add that Shayla is collecting Lumberjack artifacts for the museum. If you've got an old peavey in the garage or, axe in the basement or something not doing anything, then you know it's a 100-year-old axe, contact her. She's going to do some promotion on social media and the newspapers to try to get some more donations in. They need to have more tools. What we're looking at back there is that 15-foot long pike pole, the longest pike pole I've ever seen. So let's congratulate Shayla on finding that, because that's amazing. We're going to see video tonight of Riverjacks using pike poles. And they're dancing across the logs, holding these things. They could never do it with that. That's Paul Bunyan's pike pole, okay? Well, just really briefly about myself, my name is Bill Jamerson. I hail from the Upper Peninsula, and I do 4 different programs on history. Lumberjacks, iron miners, ski jumpers, and CCC boys. I've been here a couple times to do my CCC boys program because Those were the young men who built Interstate State Park back in the 1930s. And it's a great story. But tonight we're going to talk about lumberjacks. And I was introduced to this story when I was a child. My family used to take train trips from Lower Michigan to Houston, Texas to visit my grandfather in the early 60s. And I remember I was 8, 9 years old, and my granddad was the cook in the kitchen. He just ruled the roost, right? He used to bake these hams so tender, you could cut it with a fork, with no knife, okay? That's how delicious it was. And I remember as a little boy, I said, "Granddad, where'd you learn to cook so good?" He said, "In a lumberjack camp." I said, "What's that?" And over the years, he shared some of his stories with me. And it's funny that, 50 years later, I'm sharing these with you. He was orphaned at the age of 13. His father passed on, and the stepmother kicked the children out of the house in London, England. This is like 1907. And he spent 2 years working in a fur mill, sorting out furs, and saved enough money, probably $50, and bought passage to Canada to work in a lumberjack camp. And he was out in the woods, they were sawing trees, and some of you may know that when you saw down a tree, sometimes the darn thing doesn't fall. The branches get hung up, right? So you saw the next tree, you cut the next tree, it doesn't fall. So they had 4 or 5 trees all sticking together, and the branches. Well, they bring in the horses, right, and the ropes to pull those trees on. Well, they were doing this, and they started falling. And they yelled at my grandfather. His name was Bill, and I was named after him. "Run, Bill!" And he ran, and the damn tree crashed like 10 feet behind him, almost killed him. He says, "No more sawing logs for me. I'm going to go work in the cook shanty." And he became what they called a cookee. And those are the teenage boys that washed dishes, prepped the food, cleared the dishes, and did all types of things, cleaning and so forth. So he worked in the kitchen for 2 years and became like an assistant cook. And then he went back to England to fight in the First World War in 1916. And fought in North Africa. I mean, I could do a whole program on his life. But the main thing is it changed his life. He became a cook in his life. He worked on the Santa Fe Railroad as a cook. He ran a lunchroom in Danville, Illinois at the train station. But when he first came into camp, they asked him, "Do you have any lice?" "Oh, no." "Well, you will tomorrow." The reason is because they slept in these bunk beds that held 4 men each. Okay? Now there's some pictures back there on the rear table of single bunk beds. So there were a variety, but generally speaking, these bunkhouses had 5-foot wide beds that slept 4 men, and the reason was to stay warm. There was chinking between the logs, but in the springtime it would frost and thaw and so forth. The chinking would fall out. You'd have these cold drafts coming through. And also, when they built a fire in a log cabin in a bunkhouse, they did not add new wood in the morning hours. So in other words, they had it roaring hot through midnight, 2, 3, 4 a.m. in the morning. It would die out. So that bunkhouse got very chilly. So you had 4 men sleeping side by side. And by the way, when you slept with a lumberjack, the noses were all pointing in the same direction. Okay? You don't want to be nose to nose with a lumberjack. That's why the lice were prevalent and bed bugs. They would literally jump from one shoulder to the other shoulder. So if a lumberjack says he's having a lousy day, you know what he's talking about. That's a lot of our language comes from the lumberjack days. Hit the hay. They slept on hay mattresses. Don't let the bed bugs bite. They had bed bugs in those lumberjack camps. Don't fly off the handle. Sometimes the axe head would be frozen on that handle. And whoosh, yeah. I'm really in the pits. Every fall, they would dig a long pit, long narrow pit, and in the wintertime, if they had to saw a log into boards, they would lay that log over the pit. One man would be down there, it's like 5 foot deep. He'd be sawing vertically, there'd be a man on top sawing vertically, and they could saw that log into boards, straight boards. You can't do it horizontally, as you know. So the man in the pit was eating all that sawdust. He was in the pits, right? All kinds of Oh, how about a day late and $1 short? That's a lumberjack term. You see, if you wanted a spot in a lumberjack camp, you had to go there in the fall by, say, November 15th and give them $1 to reserve your space. Okay? And if you didn't get that $1 there by that certain day, you didn't get a spot in that lumber camp. Okay, so you were a day late and $1 short. Yeah. That prevented lumberjacks from saying, oh, I'll go work for you and I'll go work for you, and not showing up, you see. Because $1 back then was worth $25, $30 in today's money. Anyway, my granddad said when he moved into that bunkhouse, it was smoky. The men all smoked pipes, and they were superstitious. And they wouldn't open the windows. There were just a couple little windows to begin with. But it was just, and you had this, the gloves hanging to dry, the socks, the boots covered with bear grease drying out. It was like the worst kind of locker room smell you could imagine. That was one of his impressions. But they were grateful for the work. They came from the old country, and they came over to Homestead. And one of the songs I like to open up with is what I call a song that popularizes the myth of the lumberjack. We've all heard the story of the lumberjacks, how they worked all winter long, and then they blew their stake in the springtime, right? You've heard the expression, blow it? Yeah, that came from the lumberjack days. They were required to stay in camp all winter, but every spring they got paid. They'd go into town, wine, women, song, gambling, they'd blow that money. That's a popular myth, but actually it wasn't quite true. Maybe 10% of them blew their stake. Just like at our casinos today, about 10% of the population is blowing their stake at the casino, right? But my grandfather told me the lumberjacks were very serious. They came over here to Homestead. They wanted to buy property. They wanted to work the land. They wanted to send money home for their brothers to come over, for their wives to come over. They weren't going to go blow all their money in the springtime. So, anyway, this song, by the way, if you wonder, when did these fellows, have time to sing songs? Well, it was Saturday night, because they got Sunday off. So Saturday night, they could stay up late. Normally, they were in bed by 9 o'clock, but they could stay up late, and they would tell tall tales, and they would sing songs. Typically, there was someone with a button accordion, maybe a fiddle, very few guitars. You almost never hear of guitars in a camp. But the songs were sung, kind of old-fashioned folksy. Like this first song is, I'm a jolly shanty boy, I love to sing and dance. I wonder what those girls would say if they could see my worn-out pants. They were sung like that, very slow. And I know this because you can go on YouTube and hear lumberjacks singing songs from, 100 years. They recorded them. And they're, kind of a melody like this. But if I sung it like that, you'd all leave, okay? So I kind of moved up the tempo a little bit. By the way, these songs came from a book. John Beck, professor at University of Michigan, he interviewed all these old lumberjacks back in the 1930s and wrote down the lyrics of all these songs. So these are authentic songs. I'm a jolly shanty boy, I love to sing and dance. Wonder what those girls would say if they could see my worn-out pants. With 16 patches on the knees, 8 upon the stern, I wear them in the woods and at home when I return. I don't care if rich or poor, I'm not for strife or grief. I'm ragged, dirty, and loud, and I'm tough as Spanish beef. With patched up clothes and rubber boots and mud up to my knees, lice as big as chili beans that are fighting with the fleas. But now I'm on my jolly way, I just got paid today. Come and drink lager beer and stay with me all day. I don't care if rich or poor, I'm not for strife or grief. I'm ragged, dirty, and loud, and I'm tough as Spanish beef. Though the dark-eyed single lassies, they think a heap of me. I love to chase them all around when I go out on my spree. the corn. I don't care if rich or poor, I'm not for strife or grief. I'm ragged, dirty, and loud, and I'm tough as Spanish beef. Tough as Spanish beef. And they were tough. They would fight you over nothing. And lumberjacks were dirty fighters. You know, bite off part of your ear, your nose might be slit. They called it lumberjack smallpox. It's stamp on your face with the caulk boots. They were dirty, nasty fighters. They were foul-mouthed. They cussed a lot. They didn't smell so nice. They didn't take baths very often. We all know that story. But within those lumberjacks, there were good qualities. They worked from can see to can see. They worked all day long in the daylight. They would get up early in the morning. You've heard the expression, it's daylight in the swamps. That's what the cook would yell, you know, at 5 o'clock in the morning when it was still dark. And get them up. They'd have a full meal. And then they'd have to take their axe, their saws, and they'd use lanterns, and they would walk to the work site because they had to be there at daybreak. Okay? Think about that. It's 10 below zero, and you're walking in the dark, and you're going to wait for the sun to come up to start chopping and sawing trees. Okay? And they would work until it was dark, from can-see to can-see. And they didn't complain. They were grateful. Why? Because it was better than the old country. You see, in the old countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, especially those Scandinavian, what happened is there was an industrialization process on the farms back in the late 19th century. You had these horse-drawn reapers, okay? Instead of going on just thrashing one man at a time, they had machinery. And what happened, that reduced the need for labor. Suddenly, you could farm 50 acres with 10 men instead of 50 men. Well, these jobs just disappeared. And the oldest son inherited the property. They didn't divide farms, okay? So if you were the second, third son, you had no chance to own property. And there were no schools for the common man over there. So what happened is you signed your name away and became an indentured servant or serf. And what they did, they promised you a roof over your head and a bed, and they promised you 3 meals a day, but there was no schooling opportunities, no hunting opportunities, no chance to earn money. You weren't being paid. And by law, they could work you 14, 16 hours a day. In Finland, up until 1905, you could work a serf. The day was 4 a.m. to 8 p.m. They had 8 hours off. Imagine that. And so to come to America and work 10 hours, why, that's a good deal. So they were grateful. So it's all perspective, okay? My grandfather also said they took a lot of pride in their work. Everybody knew who the fastest chopper was, who the fastest sawyer was. I did a program once, and this fellow said that his grandfather was a skidder. After they cut the trees into logs, they skid them across the ground over the snow. They have a little, what they call a go devil, which is like a little sled, holds the log up, and they would drag it with the horses. Well, he was the fastest skidder in camp, and all the men were jealous. They said, oh, he's got the fastest horse. So they gave him the slowest horse. Guess who was the fastest skidder? See, all the other men were beating their horses and cussing. He just had a way with horses. Now, those men weren't paid to be the hardest workers. They weren't paid to be the fastest. But that's pride. Today, pride is, you know, what color your skin is or ethnicity, right? It's all been changed. Pride used to mean you wanted to be the very best at what you did, regardless if you got paid more for it. He also said the men never spoke disparaging about women in a lumber camp. These men could be foul-mouthed, they could be dirty fighters, but if you said something bad about a woman, you got a knuckle sandwich, okay? They were tough. So these men had good qualities to them. And they were coming over to basically save money to become homesteaders. So I'd like to share another song, which I think more accurately reflects the life of a lumberjack. And it's kind of a quieter song. Imagine getting up at 5 a.m. in the morning, walking a half hour to a campsite, a work site, to cut trees. So Some days it was so cold, the flame in the kerosene lamp would freeze. That wasn't so bad, but at night, they'd have to break off that frozen flame and throw it in the woods, okay? It would start little forest fires. I do that. I'll do that tomorrow with the school to the 4th graders. I'll say, is that true? Yeah. A lumberjack's life is a wearisome one, although it's free from care. It's swinging an axe from morning till night in the cold forest air. Or sleeping in a bunkhouse dreary while winter winds do blow. But as soon as the morning star appears, to the wild woods we must go. The rapids are raging, the water is high. There's a log jam to break swamps and cry. As he spoke, that log jam broke, taking our friend for a ride. On the banks of a river in the swamps and bogs, we've been working all winter, getting out all our logs. When springtime comes, we'll bid adieu and wonder where we're headed to. Yeah, my favorite line in that song is, here's to a lumberjack bad or good who toil in the dark green wood. Though rough of dress and a look that's grim, there's a good heart inside of him. These were honest, hard-working men. My grandfather said there was no stealing in the lumberjack camp. And that's really remarkable. They're out there for 4 months. They would come in December and start working, and typically they were paid $1 a day. Now $1 a day in the 1880s, that's worth $30 a day. You could buy a new pair of shoes for $1.25, a blanket for $2. You had a camp store. It was called a Wanigan. And the Wanigan was also it's the same name of a raft that would float down on these river drives. And that's where the cook worked. He prepared the meals for the men. So you might, let's say you're 17 years old. Your name is Jan Johansson. You're from Sweden. And you come over to America with a shirt on your back. And by the way, people tell me about, come up and tell me stories. One woman told me that her grandparents came from Sweden, her great-grandparents, and they walked from New York to Chicago. And then they took a train from Chicago up to the north woods of Wisconsin to work in a lumberjack camp. Now you may be wondering, why did they walk? Well, they had no money. And as they walked, they probably timed their trip to come in the spring or the summer so they could work, right? They could harvest tomatoes in Pennsylvania and maybe harvest asparagus in northern Ohio, who knows? But they would work maybe for a week or two and maybe buy enough for a train fare and walk. But they got to Chicago, had enough money to take a train up to the North Woods. But they came here and $1 a day, $1 a day is $30 a month. And over 4 months, that's $120. That's a lot of money back then. For a 17-year-old from Sweden who came with his shirt on his back, yes.
Well, I just thought of something that goes back a little ways when you're talking about the Wanigan.
Yes.
Our city festival between here and across the river in Taylor's Falls, we have Wanigan days. And that might be something you want to bring up with the kids.
Yeah, Wanigan days.
Yep.
I've been there. I was there 10, 12 years ago.
Still have it.
It's terrific.
It's still there.
Yeah, it's still there. I kind of dropped doing, anyway, I was doing a lot of touring with my CCC boys, so I kind of dropped the ball on Lumberjack for a while. So imagine you make $120, but they're going to take money out of your paycheck for those things which you bought in the camp store, right? You bought some boots and, like I said, a blanket and an overcoat. So maybe you leave camp with $80. Well, $40 in the 1880s, well, that bought you 40 acres of land. That's the Homestead Act, right? Think about it. You're 17 years old, you come over with your shirt on your back, you work 4 months in the woods, you have enough to buy 40 acres of land. That's what we call the American dream. It still goes on today. Now you just bought 40 acres of stumps. Okay, so maybe you build a little shack out there, and now you got to pull stumps. How do you do that? Well, you're going to buy a stump puller. And it's like a winch, and you bring in a horse, and there are many different designs, but basically the horse will walk in a circle, and you cut the roots, you know, with an axe. And then, by the way, those pine trees, the roots go horizontally, which is a real blessing. And you cut and you pull those stumps. And maybe you got a buddy who helps you. So the first summer you pull maybe 5 acres of stumps. So what do you do in the fall? You go back in the camp. You make another $120, but this time you send $50 back to your brother in Sweden, and your brother Jürgen, he comes and joins you, right? So now you got 2 guys pulling stumps. And maybe they clear 10 more acres, 7 more, then they go back in the woods, you see? And after 5, 6, 7 years, they've cleared 40 acres of stumps and stones, and he's ready to become a farmer. Now he sends money back for his wife, okay? This is the story. It was typically a single male that came over, sacrificed, and sent money home and brought other family members over. And like I said, it still goes on today. And this is how this is where the cornfields came from. Because at one point, we know that Wisconsin was just covered with trees. And they all said, well, these trees will last for 500 years. Well, that may have been true if they used an axe. But in the 1870s, someone came up with a raker tooth. Some of you may know they had crosscut saws for centuries, right? But someone added a raker tooth to rake out the sawdust, and that enabled them to cut down these big cork pines, you know, using crosscut saws, which they could do in 30 or 40 minutes instead of 5 hours with an axe. And so that sped up the production. There were many jobs in the camps. When I go into the schools, I always say it's like a football team. You've got the center that hikes the ball, the quarterback takes the ball, he hands it off to the fullback. It was a team effort, and they were very well run. The sawyers, men with the saws, would saw down the trees. You had the choppers, men who were good with axes. And the swampers, they were also axemen. They cleared out trails, they cleared off the branches. So you had all different specific jobs. You had the skidder, who we talked about earlier. After you got the tree on the ground, you cut it into 12, 14, 16-foot sections. And the skidder would skid the logs to the sleigh. And the sleigh was run by the teamster. The teamster handles a team of horses, right? And the sleighs, you're going to see it in a video in a few minutes, were low-slung sleighs. They typically stacked the logs about 10 feet high. We've all seen pictures where the logs are like 15 feet high, right? Those were called picture loads. Photographers would come up from the cities or Chicago. How high can you stack those logs? Oh, we can get them 15 feet high. And they'd pose up there, you know, on top of these logs. Those would never be taken down the trails. They were just too dangerous. Those were pictures. They put them on postcards. Now, you may wonder, how did these men load those logs? Well, they used winches. They used pulleys and block and tackle, and they would haul these logs up, and the man at the top, standing on the top, he was called the top loader. He had a peavey in his hand, you know, this thick pole with a sharp point. He'd guide those logs over. Sometimes the logs would bump and they'd spin. They called that a cannon, and that would knock them off. And so the most dangerous job in camp was the top loader, standing on top of those logs. So once they've got those logs about 10 feet high, the teamster would take them down these long trails down to the river. Now in the fall, they went out with a rut cutter, and they cut these 2 grooves in the soil, you know, maybe 8 inches deep and 6 feet wide, 6 inches wide, and those corresponded to the runners of the sleigh, of course. So then they would go out and ice the trails. They had boys, 10, 12-year-old boys with these tanking sleighs, like a water tank on a sleigh. Go out at 4 a.m. in the morning, splash water, and that would freeze and it'd create these grooves in the ice. And so the horses could follow those grooves and take them down to the river. And those boys were called ice monkeys, by the way. Very dangerous work. So it was a real team effort. Now what they did in the wintertime, they would stack the logs along the river banks. The rivers are frozen, most of them are at least. So they would put posts along the riverbanks, stack the logs up maybe 6, 7 feet high. So if you can imagine, along the St. Croix River in the 1880s, just for miles and miles would be just logs stacked up 4, 5, 6 feet high, waiting for the spring thaw so they could roll the logs down into the river and down to the sawmills where they turn them into boards. By the way, when these guys sang their songs on Saturday night, they'd get up and dance too. Yeah. One of them would take a handkerchief, put it over his arm like this, and he'd play the role of the woman, right, when they were dancing. Or he might put on an apron. Yeah. Yeah. That was going on. When you're in the woods for 4 months, you make your own fun, right? Well, one fellow wrote a song about all the different jobs in the woods. It's called Shanty Boy in the Pines. Gather round, you shanty boys, listen to my song. It's all about the pine woods and how we get along. I am a jolly shanty boy, so merry and so fine, who spends a pleasant winter cutting down the pine. At 4 in the morning, the cook loudly shouts, "Get up all you teamsters, it's daylight in the swamps." Teamsters get up and rush around and say, "We cannot find our boots and our socks have gone astray." Choppers are the next ones up, their socks they cannot find. They blame it on the teamsters and cuss them till they're blind. Their boots, straps, and rubbers are laid off to one side. Hats and gloves and rags are all hung up to dry. Now they didn't steal your socks, but they might switch them. You wake up in the morning and you find a pair of socks full of holes, right? Who took my good socks? These are full of holes. Come on, give them back, guys. Well, the choppers and the sawyers lay the timber low. Skidders and the swampers move it to and fro. Then come the loaders before the break of day. Load up the sleigh, my boys, to the river. Haste away. Well, I'm going to show a little video now. I like to show a little video. This is called From Stump to Ship. This was shot in 1930. By the way, the stock market went up like 9% today. Uh-oh, okay, what happened? Oh, this is just... There we go.
Third Lake Old Stream. These logs are landed in a cove.
I'm going to go ahead. If we could dim the lights, please, Shayla, or anyone else back there. What we're looking at is, in this case, they put the logs on the lake, okay? Now, this is a team of horses pulling a sleigh that's just recently been unloaded, okay? So we can't see how high the logs, but I'm guessing the logs are probably 5, 6 feet high, but they're taking them out on the river and putting the logs directly on the ice. Now this is, of course, what it looks like when that ice thaws. Now the men who worked on the river were called rivermen, river rats, river hogs, and they weren't paid $1 a day, they were paid $3 a day because the work was so dangerous. It was cold, wet, and dangerous. Those poles are peavies. If it's a thick pole, okay, with a big hook on it, that's a peavy. And they're pushing those logs out into the river to get the log drive going, okay? And you have 3 or 4 men might work on one log if it was stuck. Later on, we'll see men with long, narrow poles. Those are called pike poles, and that's a pike pole. See that long, narrow pole? And that has a little twist on the tip. Look at them. They used caulk boots, which have, little cleats on them. allow them to grip it. That is very dangerous. If you go, there's their caulk boots they wore to grip those logs. Isn't that amazing? See, if they really have to push the logs heavy, they use the thick peavies. If they just need to isolate one particular log like these fellows, they use the pike poles. Now there were two types of rivermen. Now look at this. This is very dangerous. Two men on a log, the other guy barely gets off, okay? It's like, oh. They had two types of rivermen. You had a sacking crew, and those were the men that pulled the logs off the banks, and the jamming crew. Those were the men that broke up the log jams. Now, here they're eating their meal, and they have a wanigan who does, well, in this case they have the tent set up, but the men had 4 meals a day. Breakfast at 5 a.m., a mid-morning snack like 10 a.m. where they have hot stew and biscuits, then 2 o'clock lunch, and then at the end of the day they'd have a full meal. Now the average CCC boy, we'll talk about the food after this. Now this is what it looks like going down the rapids. This is really dangerous. But getting back to the jamming crew, on the St. Croix River in 1886 there was a log jam that required 200 men to break up, and it took them 6 weeks. And the way you break up a log jam is a straw boss would go out on the logs, they'd be all stationary, piled up, and he would point to the key log. Now a key opens up a door, so if you could unloose the key log, that would release the other logs, okay? He'd say, Joey, Elmer, Fred, you get that log. And then he'd point, Tony, Louie, Charlie, you get that log. You have 3 or 4 men working on a specific log to break up that log jam. Now this is an example, you know, and the ability to identify those logs was a very developed ability. I mean, imagine how difficult. You've got thousands of logs, and he has to pick out the logs which will release the other logs. Now if that doesn't work, they bring in teams of horses, and they have long ropes, and they will pull those logs to release them. And if that doesn't work, they use dynamite to blow up those logs, to break up that log jam. And the local townspeople of St. Croix would go out on Sunday afternoon, and the afternoon entertainment was to watch the Lumberjacks break up the log jams. Can you imagine that? This was before there was NFL football, okay? They would go out and sit on the banks and watch the breaking up the log jam. Food was all important in a lumberjack camp. Look at these characters. Oh, yeah. Their food was, now that's a real log jam. That is a real serious log jam. And these river drives might go 10 miles, they may go 200 miles, okay? So you can just imagine, sometimes the men were on river drives for months, several months. Look at them hopping across those. It's just hard to imagine that today. And they said that like 1 out of 20 men never returned alive, okay? Because if you go down, there's just no way to get up. And if a man lost his life, they would take his boots and hang it on a nearby tree. Or they may put some stones on the bottom where just to kind of mark the spot, okay? Look at that log drive. Yeah. Anyway, that gives you a little sense. We'll go back and talk about the food now. Where's that? Okay, yeah. Now the most important food in a lumberjack camp were beans. They served them beans 3 meals a day. And they would cook the beans, and we're talking, you know, Navy, Pinto, like 4 or 5, see that hole they're putting it in right there? Did you catch that? I'm going to back it up a little bit. That pot there is full of beans. It's full of beans. They would cook the beans until they were halfway done, okay? Then they would put them in a hole that had a fire burning. And this is very important. Then they would put the ashes on top of the pot, okay? And they would add, there it is, there's a pot going down in the hole. They put ashes on top to heat it up and to draw the moisture out. And they put chunks of salt pork, molasses, brown sugar, and they were wonderfully flavored. They just loved the beans. They gave them a lot of protein, and they called them logging berries. They also called them linen lifters. They had nicknames for everything, okay? And there he is, scooping out the beans. Look at that. 4 meals a day. They love those beans, and they love beans more than pancakes. When they served pancakes, they called stove lids or belly shingles. They had nicknames for everything. And one story I ran across was how this fellow was pouring Karo syrup on his pancakes, and a dead mouse fell out. And he complained to the cook. The cook came by and picked up the mouse by the tail and scraped off the syrup with a knife. Okay, you can eat your pancakes now. See, in a lumberjack camp, you never complained about your food. If the cook overheard you complaining, you had to wash the dishes. One fellow was complaining about his coffee. He said, they called it blackjack. This tastes like paint. And the cook overheard him. And the cook came out and said, what'd you say about my coffee? Why, I said, it tastes just like paint, and that's just the way I like it. Yeah. Now, boiled eggs were called cackleberries. Donuts were called sinkers. Muffins were called doorknobs. Apples were called forbidden fruit. Potatoes were Murphy's. They had nicknames for everything. And when you sat at a table, at a lumberjack table, you didn't put your elbows on the table. Oh no. And you sat in your same spot every night. And if someone said, pass the berries, the logging berries, the beans, you wouldn't scoop from those beans until they reached the person who asked for them, okay? So there was a whole set of rules that you had to go by in those lumber camps. Now what we're seeing here, obviously, is the logs being taken into the sawmill where they were cut into boards. Now the economics of a lumber camp are pretty simple. And I'm just going to go over this quickly, and if it doesn't make sense, that's okay. But a board foot is 1 inch by 12 inches by 12 inches. A board foot. Now you could acquire land outside of La Crosse in 1885 for $2 per 1,000 board feet. You could run a logging camp, hire the men, put up the buildings, feed the men, and harvest those trees for $3 per board feet, for 1,000 board feet. And then you could do the river drive for about $2.50 per 1,000 board feet. So what I'm saying is, for about $7.50, you could buy the land, harvest the trees, get them to the sawmill for $7.50 per 1,000 board feet. Well, the going price for lumber in 1885 was $15 per board feet. Now these camps could get out a few million board feet, and the profits were like, the equivalent of like $300,000. And in today's money, that would be worth millions, okay? These camps could be very, very profitable. However, you did have weather to contend with. If you had a warm spring, you couldn't get the logs down to the river, for example. There were log thieves and so forth. They would mark the logs with log marks. And that's when they floated them down the river. That identified the logging camp. But there were log thieves that would cut off the end of the log and put their own log mark on it and claim possession of it. But it was extremely efficient and extremely profitable, and that's why these lumber camp owners kept moving west, right? They'd go from Michigan to Wisconsin, on to Minnesota, and they would end up in Washington State. They just keep going, and they would just rape and pillage the land and leave a wake of destruction in their past, in their back, and behind them. But these trees in this area built the homes and the buildings in the Great Plains. They were going out to Omaha, to Fargo, okay? They needed the lumber. So it's a beautiful story. Okay, we can have the lights, please. How's our time doing here? You know, we should really have beans here tonight, shit. We got any Van Camp beans back there?
I can run home quick, I got home.
Oh, you know, the Lumberjacks love pie as well. They serve them pie 3 times a day. And there was not an eighth of a piece, it was a quarter piece of pie. Mincemeat, apple, prune pie. And you may wonder, how do these lumber camps make apple pie in the middle of winter, you know, when they're way up in Timbuktu? Well, they would buy dried apples. One of my favorite museums is in Eau Claire, at the Paul Bunyan Lumberjack Museum. And they have, on the wall, they have the invoices for the cook's invoices for his shopping. It'd be like 800 pounds of sugar, 1,000 pounds of flour, you know, 700 pounds of dried apples. Unbelievable what a typical order would. And then they take their you know, horse-drawn sleighs into town and buy these huge sacks of flour and dried fruit. And that's what they made the pies out of. Typically, the Lumberjacks would eat 5,000 calories a day. That's what a linebacker in the NFL eats, okay? That's a lot of calories. Why? Well, those were 4 meals, and they were out there working. They were pulling that saw. They called it a misery whip. They're out there all day long, and they burn a lot of calories. So for breakfast, you've got, you know, biscuits and oatmeal and beans and bacon and, you know, they just stuff themselves and go. Western was the finest place, costly as the garments before my embrace. I called it my jewel, she be a gem for life. Treachery she showed me, but ne'er took my life. I earned on the river, I earned quite a stake. Oh, steadfast and steady, I played not the rate. My wages the same to keep safe. I begrudged her nothing that I owned on this earth. One day on a river, a letter I received. She said from her promises she had been relieved to be with her new love, a long time delayed. Next time I saw her, she would not be a maid. On her mother, Jane Tucker, I placed. It's still very dangerous work. But they all had health insurance. They would buy insurance for like $5, $5, $6, $7, which covered several hospitals, maybe a half dozen hospitals in that area. And they would buy this in the fall before they went into camps. They'd have a little letter that said they would be taken care of in the event of injury. And the convents oftentimes cared for the men as well. And they'd have these little certificates that showed that they would be taken care of. It was very, very hard work. And but these fellows, it was, when I meet people and they tell me the stories of their grandfathers, it was a kind of a thing that they were grateful for. They said out in the woods, they said it was, how can I put it? They said there was like a melody to the sound of the saw. When you're out there, it's almost like you're in a different world. If you're in the woods in the wintertime and the snow, you know what it's like. It's very quiet. It was a very peaceful place. And so for these immigrants to come over and work, it was a very satisfying experience. And I've had people tell me stories like, I was at a nursing home once. This fellow said that when he was a little boy, they had a lumberjack work on the family farm in the summertime. His name was Isaac. And Isaac had his own little log cabin, and he had a cast iron stove. And as a little boy, he said, Isaac, I said, there's mice prints in your bacon grease. Oh, don't worry about those. Those will go away when I start cooking again. Yeah. He said Isaac took him hunting for honey. And he would take a piece of rotten fruit and hold it up in the air, and the bees would come and take the nectar, and then they would follow that bee as far as it could go. Then they would do it again, follow another bee, and after 3 or 4 bees, it led them to a hollowed out tree. They cut it down, filled 2 wash basins full of honeycomb, you know. A woman told me that her grandmother was a cook in a lumber camp, and all her girlfriends say, why would you want to do that? She said, well, I want to marry a lumberjack on a Wednesday in July. And she did. I've never heard that expression before. Or the fellow, what's Bovine, Minnesota. He said his grandfather was a jailhouse keeper in Bovine, Minnesota, and in the jail there was like a 2-foot wide hole cut into the floorboards so the men could escape. I said, come on, you gotta be kidding me. Oh no, he said the reason they did that, he wanted the men to escape. He didn't want to feed them, too expensive. So if they escaped, they were now felons. And so they got out of town, okay? Interesting stories like that. Or the fellow who told me that his grandfather was a teenage boy, and his father was the lumberjack brass hat, the boss. He'd been drinking too much the night before, and the next day was payday. And the lumberjacks were all, we're going to break into that safe and take our money. And his father was like 14, sat on the floor with a pistol. No one's getting in this safe till my dad gets up, Or the teenager who was asked to go into town and get a shipment from the last shipment from the store, okay, of provisions. He was on a horse-drawn sleigh. He was loaded up with provisions, flour and sugar, coming back to camp, going over a lake, soft snow, it was in the spring, and a pack of wolves was chasing him, nipping at their heels. So he climbs in the back and throws salt pork out to them, right? And he made it back to camp safely. So it was just a whole different era. And young fellas, 15, 16, often worked in those camps and put up with incredible conditions. But how about one more song? This song is written about, well, the name of the song is Boys Stay Away from Girls, okay? I think one of the guys must have lost one of his buddies to a gal, and he didn't want anyone else to, so he wrote a little song about it. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. And we want to thank Shayla again for her work at the Historical Society. If you're not a member, please join. And if you know of anyone that has a tool they can donate, please let them know, because they are looking for new artifacts, old photographs, anything tools, and to encourage schools to bring their students by. I know I don't want to be too redundant on this, but young people need to know that their great-great-grandparents had it so hard, and yet they were grateful. They didn't complain about the work. We live in an age where everything, we want to be comforted. We don't want to suffer and go through hard times. And young people know they're a lot tougher than they think. I always say, you're made of the same stuff as your great-great-granddad. You can do it. You can do it. You don't believe it, but you can. And so we want to keep that going. So let's go back to the 1880s. We're in a bunkhouse on a Saturday night. Love is a mighty funny thing. Catches the young and old. Just like a plate of boarding house hash, for many a man it has sold. You feel like a freshwater eel. Causes your head to swell. You lose your mind because love is blind, and it empties your wallet as well. When a man gets gone on a pretty girl, he talks as gentle as a dove. He calls her honey, and he spends his money to show her that he's in love. When honeymoon's over, things start to change. I'll tell you, that old saying's true. One man's worth two in the bush. What's a fella to do? A warning to all you young men. Don't be in a hurry to wed. You think you're in clover till the honeymoon's over, then you will wish you were dead. Stay away from girls. Thank you so much. Any questions out there? Yeah. Okay, if you do, I'll be around for a few minutes. Cheryl, any announcements to make, upcoming programs or?
No, but please help yourself to some sweet things back there before you go home.
Some lumberjack treats back there.
Yeah, next year I'll really make